James's phone buzzes at noon. Unknown number. The message is short. 2 days is fast. James, are you sure she can handle it? Someone is watching them. Someone knows about Hanoi. And whoever it is wants Diep to break before she even gets on that road. James stares at the screen. His jaw goes tight. He doesn't answer. He just forwards it to the investigator with 2 words. Document this. Like and subscribe if you've ever had someone try to scare you right when you're finally moving forward. 2 days. That's what the investigator's message said. And somehow those 2 words made the whole house feel different that morning. Like the walls were holding their breath. Diep didn't cry about it, didn't sit down and spiral. She did what she always does when life gets uncertain. She cleaned the counter, lined up the jars, checked the stove twice. Because when your mind is shaking, your hands can still do something steady. The kitchen smelled like jasmine soap and rice from last night. Morning light came in soft through the window. And for a minute, just a minute, everything felt normal. Then Nai shuffled in, half asleep, her stuffed orange tucked under one arm. She rubbed her eyes and asked the question like it was a password. A careful mode? Diep smiled, despite everything. Careful mode. Nai nodded, satisfied, and climbed into her chair. The dog padded in behind her and sat down near the stove like a quiet guard. James came out already dressed, shirt pressed, shoes tied, but he didn't rush to the door. He walked straight to Diep, lowered his voice, and said the most important thing first. And today stays normal, he said. For her. Diep looked at him, then at Nai pouring milk too carefully into her bowl. For her, Diep agreed. James crouched down next to Nai's chair. Rules? He asked. Nai sat up straighter, like she was reciting something important. Hold hands. No strangers. Tell Mom. James kissed her forehead. Perfect. Nai beamed and went back to her cereal. Diep caught James's eye across the table. They didn't say anything else. They didn't need to. At Hill Fruits. Diep ran the morning shift like she always did. Clean labels, temperature logs filled out neat. No shortcuts. Luan was at the counter joking with a customer about jackfruit prices. The cold unit hummed in the back. Everything looked ordinary. But Diep's eyes kept going to the door. Not fear exactly. Awareness, Mr. Hung stopped by mid-morning. He did his quiet inspection, checked the display, glanced at the logbook, nodded once. Orderly, he said. Diep answered the way she always did. Orderly means peaceful. But her voice sounded different today. Tighter. Mister. Hung noticed. He waited until Luan stepped into the back room. Then he spoke quietly. Something pressing you? Diep hesitated. She could say no. Keep it private. But Mr. Hung wasn't the kind of man who asked without reason. She chose honesty, a safe amount of it. Someone is circling my family, she said. And I don't like it. Mr. Hung's face didn't change much, but his eyes sharpened. If you need extra eyes at the shop, he said, you tell me. No shame in protection. Diep swallowed. It was thank you. Mister. Hung nodded once and left without making it a big thing. But Diep felt steadier after that. Across town, James was running his office like a man clearing the deck before a storm. He rescheduled meetings, assigned coverage for the next few days, locked down access to personal files on the server. Then he called his assistant into his office and closed the door. "No one discusses my family with anyone," he said. Clear, calm, final. If someone asks, you redirect to business. If they keep pushing, you document it and tell me immediately. His assistant blinked. "Is this about that visitor, Mr. Hoan?" James didn't flinch. "Yes," he said, "and it ends now." She nodded. Understood. James went back to his desk, opened his laptop, tried to focus on export paperwork, and that's when his phone buzzed. Unknown number. He stared at the screen for a second before opening it. The message was short. 2 days is fast. "James, are you sure she can handle it?" James's jaw went tight. His fingers curled around the phone. He didn't reply. Instead, he forwarded the number to the investigator with one line. "Confirm if this is Hoan's network. Document everything." Then he set the phone face down on the desk and forced himself back to work. Because that's what you do when someone tries to rattle you. You don't give them the reaction they want. When James got home that afternoon, the house was busy in a good way. The bathroom project was finally getting finished. Boards squared up, edges sanded smooth, water line marked out clean. James's father was standing by the back corner with his arms crossed, watching the work like he had opinions, but was choosing restraint for once. Diep handed James a screwdriver without saying anything. James took it. They worked side by side for a few minutes in silence. Then Nye ran up holding a piece of paper. "I made a travel plan," Chatushi announced. Diep wiped her hands on a rag. "A travel plan?" Nye held up her drawing proudly. A crooked car, 3 stick figures inside, and a very serious sign that said in big letters, "No scare." James laughed. Quiet, but real. "That's an excellent plan," he said. Nye nodded like a professional. "We go, and we come back." James's smile softened. He crouched down to her level. "Yes," he said. "We come back." Diep looked at that drawing and felt something tight in her chest. Her daughter believed trips could be safe if you just wrote the rules down clearly enough. She wanted to believe that too. That evening, after Nye was asleep and the dog was curled up near her bed, James and Diep sat at the kitchen table. The stove ticked as it cooled. The house was quiet. James didn't start with Hanoi. He started with boundaries. "I want you to hear this clearly," he said. "Nobody, Mr. Hoan, my father, anyone, gets to corner you. If someone approaches you, you don't explain yourself. You don't defend. You end the conversation and walk away." Diep's hands were wrapped around a mug of tea. She nodded. "Okay." "Second," James said, "we don't do DNA tests because someone's trying to scare us into it. If we ever do one, we do it on our terms, for truth, not for control." Diep stared into her tea. "Your father really believes I'm her daughter?" James was quiet for a second. Then he chose honesty. He believes something, James said carefully. I don't know if it's belief or guilt or strategy, but I know this. You are not a tool in his hands. Diep's fingers tightened around the mug. James, she said quietly, what if it's true? James reached across the table, covered her hand with his. Then we face it like adults, he said. And we protect Nye while we do. Diep looked down. Her voice dropped to almost a whisper. Stay, and if my mother is alive. James squeezed her hand once, gentle but firm. Then we confirm it clean, he said. Not through rumors, not through Mr. Hwan's mouth. We get proof, real proof. And then we decide what happens next. Diep took a slow breath. Okay, she whispered. We go. James watched her carefully. Are you sure? Diep lifted her eyes. They were wet, but they were strong. I'm not going because I want pain, she said. I'm going because I want my life to stop feeling like a missing page. James nodded, like the decision settled into his bones. They sat there for another minute, just breathing, just being. And then James said quietly, 2 days. Diep nodded. 2 days. They planned the trip like two people who'd learned to survive pressure by staying practical. Nye would stay with James's mother. Mr. Hung would check in at the shop. And James would keep the travel quiet. No posts. No unnecessary calls to anyone who didn't need to know. Diep chose one anchor to keep herself steady. A bedtime call with Nye every night. No matter what. The next morning, Diep packed light. One bag, clean clothes, her phone charger, and tucked into the side pocket, Nye's drawing. The one that said, no scare. She folded it carefully and zipped it in. James came into the bedroom and saw her sitting on the edge of the bed, just staring at the closed suitcase. Second thoughts? He asked quietly. Diep shook her head. Just thoughts. He sat down next to her. Their shoulders touched. We can still cancel, he said. Diep looked at him. And then what? Wait for the next message? The next person who shows up knowing things they shouldn't know? James didn't have an answer for that. Because she was right. That afternoon, Nye came home from school with her backpack bouncing and her face bright. Grandma says I can help make dumplings, she said. Diep smiled. You're staying with her for a few days, remember? Nye nodded. You and Daddy have a trip. That's right. Nye tilted her head. For work? Diep hesitated. James jumped in smooth. Something like that, he said. But we'll call you every night before bed. Nye thought about that. Then she held up her pinky. Promise? Diep hooked her pinky around Nye's tiny one. Promise. The dog sat beside Nye like he was part of the promise, too. That evening, James walked Nye over to his mother's house. Diep stayed behind to finish organizing things at home. She was wiping down the kitchen counter when she heard the front door open. Footsteps, heavier than James's. She turned. James's father stood in the doorway. Not angry, not warm either. Just there. You're leaving, he said. It wasn't a question. Diep set down the cloth. Yes. He stepped further into the kitchen, stopped near the table. For what? He asked. Diep kept her voice steady. For truth. His jaw tightened. You think truth will fix this? I think not knowing is worse, Diep said. He looked at her for a long moment. Then he said something that surprised her. If she's alive, if it's her, you don't owe her anything. Diep blinked. What? She left, he said, voice rough. People who leave don't get to come back and demand things. Diep felt something cold settle in her chest. Is that what you tell yourself? She asked quietly. About the people you've hurt? His face went hard, but he didn't answer. Diep took a breath. I'm not going for her, she said. I'm going for me, so I can stop wondering. So I can stop feeling like half my life is a blank space someone else controls. He stared at her. Then he turned and walked toward the door. But before he left, he stopped. James will protect you, he said without turning around. Even from me. And then he was gone. Diep stood there in the quiet kitchen. Heart pounding, hands shaking just a little. When James came back 20 minutes later, she told him what happened. James's face went tight, but he didn't explode. He just pulled her close. He's scared, James said quietly. He knows if the truth comes out, he loses control of the story. Diep leaned into his chest. I don't care about his story anymore. James kissed the top of her head. Good. That night, Diep went to Nui's room one more time. Nai was already asleep at Grandma's house, but Diep stood in the doorway anyway, looking at the empty bed. The stuffed orange sat on the pillow where Nai always left it. Diep picked it up, held it for a second, then set it back down gently. James found her there. You okay? He asked. Diep nodded, just saying goodnight. They went to bed early, but neither of them slept much. At some point in the dark, Diep whispered, What if I see her and I don't feel anything? James was quiet for a moment. Then you feel nothing, he said. And that's okay too. Diep turned toward him. What if I feel everything? James pulled her closer. Then I'll be right there. The next morning, they woke before dawn. Diep made tea. James checked the car. They moved around each other in the quiet house like two people who'd done hard things before and knew how to keep going. Before they left, Diep stood at the stove one last time. She turned it off, checked it twice, then touched the counter once, like saying goodbye to the thing that kept her steady. James appeared behind her with the keys. Ready? He asked. Diep picked up her bag, looked around the kitchen one more time. Then she nodded. Let's go. They walked out together, locked the door, got in the car, and as James started the engine, Diep pulled out Nie's drawing from her bag. No scare. She smoothed it flat on her lap. James glanced over, saw it, reached over and squeezed her hand once. Then he put the car in drive. And they headed toward Hanoi, not running toward drama, not chasing pain, just two people moving toward clarity. Together. Here's what gets me about this. Diep could have stayed home, could have let the fear win, could have let Mr. Hoan and James's father control the story forever. But she didn't. She packed a bag, promised her daughter she'd call, and got in that car. Because sometimes the only way to stop living in fear is to walk straight toward the thing that scares you most. And that takes more courage than most people ever have to find. Thanks for listening. Like and subscribe.